Hello, my name is Dave Bowden, the news editor here at Ballotpedia. Redistricting is something that comes up a lot in the political news these days, as there have been several major court cases on the topic in just the last few years, in addition to some ballot measures which have been decided by voters in certain states. And with the next census approaching, we're not that far away from this regular process, which can really have some dramatic effects in both Congress and state legislatures around the country. Today, we'd like to provide an overview of redistricting and look at recent court decisions on this topic at both the federal and the state level. We'll also analyze how redistricting works and where the process has changed since the last cycle after the 2010 census. And finally, we'll also look ahead to the 2020 census and give you a guide as to what news you can expect in the months ahead. To help me do all of that today is Corey Eucalito, a managing editor here at Ballotpedia. Thanks very much for joining us, Corey.
Yeah, thank you. Happy to be here.
Okay, so let's first set the stage for our overall conversation here. Can you tell me a little bit about redistricting?
Sure. So redistricting is the process by which election maps are drawn, or I'm sorry, election district maps are drawn. That encompasses congressional, state legislative, and municipal districts like city and county councils and school boards. So essentially, redistricting applies to nearly every legislative body in the country at the federal, state, and local levels.
All right, and can you give us a brief overview as to how kind of theoretically this process works?
Yeah, so every 10 years, once the US Census has been completed, the Census Bureau delivers detailed population data sets to the states. And then redistricting authorities in the states use these data sets to redraw their district maps, whether they're congressional, state legislative, or otherwise.
All right, so let's get right to kind of how elections impacts this. How do the outcomes of the 2020 elections stand to affect the next redistricting cycle?
Yeah, the stakes are high. So in 34 of the states that are holding legislative elections in 2020, the legislatures themselves play a significant part in the redistricting process. In 8 of next year's gubernatorial elections, the winner will have veto authority over state legislative or congressional district plans that are approved by the legislatures. So these 2020 elections, like I said, the political stakes are very high.
Absolutely. I imagine it's a little early yet to begin speculating about the effects of specific election outcomes. But what does what happened in the 2010 cycle tell us about the impact of elections on redistricting?
Yeah, so one way to think about how the elections preceding redistricting impact the redistricting process is to look at trifecta changes, changes in trifecta status. A trifecta occurs when one party controls both chambers of a state's legislature and the governorship. In 2010, 12 states where legislatures had redistricting authority saw changes in their trifecta status as a result of the 2010 elections. In those 12 states, Republicans gained trifecta control in 6 of them. The remainder were divided governments, and Democrats lost trifecta status in 7 of those states. So the legislators and governors elected in these states in 2010 played a direct part in the redistricting cycle that began in 2011 and for the most part ended in 2012. Now, heading into 2020, Republicans still have trifecta control of 4 of those states. Democrats regained 3 of the trifectas they lost in 2010, and the rest are divided governments.
That chart that's up on the screen really does illustrate the political implications of redistricting, both for the short term and the long term, which kind of brings me to my next question, which you've touched on a bit already. So who is ultimately responsible for redistricting in the states? Based on what you said earlier, in some cases it's the state legislature, but that's not always the case, is it?
Right. There are 3 basic types of redistricting authorities. The first and the most common is state legislatures, which we briefly talked about. The other 2 are independent commissions and political appointee commissions.
Okay, so how many states, in how many states are there, the legislature is responsible for redistricting?
36. So in 36 states, legislatures have the primary authority over at least one aspect of redistricting, whether congressional or state legislative. Usually, though, it's the legislature has control over both of those.
Okay, and then the other two are, I guess, are independent and political appointee commissions?
Yeah, so the difference is that an independent commission is made up of members who are not politicians, and the members themselves are not selected by politicians. By contrast, a political appointee commission is made up of members that are appointed by political figures like elected officials or party leaders. 4 states use independent commissions, and 10 states use political appointee commissions.
All right, this is great. So now we have kind of the rules of the process here. Now that we've talked a bit about who is responsible for redistricting, what are some of the rules that apply? I understand that generally districts must have nearly equal populations. Is any degree of variance acceptable?
Yes, so districts do generally have to have nearly equal populations. When it comes to U.S. House districts, a population spread of 1% or greater is generally considered constitutionally suspect. There's more leeway when it comes to state legislative districts. A spread of 10% or more will generally not be upheld by a court if there's a challenge. And I just want to pause really briefly. I saw a question come in about trifecta about the word trifecta. I see Jarek answer, but yeah, trifecta is any state where a single party controls both chambers of the legislature and the governorship.
All right, that's a key concept that often a lot of policy issues come back to. All right, with regard to these population variance standards, how did they develop? I mean, are these laid out in federal law, or were they established by maybe some sort of judicial precedent?
Yeah, so they're not made explicit in federal law, but they are established as court precedent. The Supreme Court issued 2 rulings on this topic in 1964. They're called Westbury v. Sanders, which applies to U.S. House districts, and Reynolds v. Sims, which applies to state legislative districts.
All right, so these rulings themselves are, over 50 years old. Have there been any recent legal challenges to these specific standards? I know we received some questions about this from some interested readers before the start of the webinar.
Yeah, so although there's general consensus that district populations should be equal, there's an ongoing debate about who should be counted. Evanwell v. Abbott was a case decided by the Supreme Court in 2016. In this case, 2 Texas voters argued that the state's legislative district plan, which was based on total population counts, should have instead been based on the total population of registered or eligible voters. Total population counts would include non-voting residents like children or prisoners. The plaintiffs in this case argued that the use of total population counts dilutes the voting power of citizens residing in districts that are home to smaller concentrations of non-voting residents. The Supreme Court rejected this argument and upheld the use of total population counts for reapportionment and redistricting.
Okay, so that's kind of where that issue stands at this point. Are there any other requirements that authorities have to take into account during the process of redistricting?
Just one at the federal level. Federal law requires that districts can't discriminate on the basis of race or ethnicity. And oftentimes, when district maps are thrown out by courts, it's this requirement in particular that serves as the basis for that decision.
Now, that's at the federal level. What about the states themselves? Do the states have and enforce their own rules above and beyond those that are established by the federal government?
Yes, some do. The most common is a requirement that districts be physically adjacent. Most states also require that districts adhere to existing political boundaries, like city and county lines, wherever that's possible. Finally, some states require that districts be compact and preserve communities of common interests, like socioeconomic groups or ethnic groups.
That's interesting. All right, I would just imagine that there are situations in which these principles could come into conflict. Is that the case?
Yeah, it is. For example, a community of common interests like an ethnic group might exist across political boundaries, and prioritizing one necessitates deprioritizing the other. And even in states where there are no legal requirements that districts be compact or contiguous, redistricting authorities still take these sometimes conflicting principles into account as they draw their maps.
Okay, so this is a really good breakdown of just the overall process of redistricting and what the criteria are. Now let's discuss some of the recent issues that stand to impact redistricting in the upcoming cycle. Earlier this year, there was a major decision issued by the Supreme Court on partisan gerrymandering. Can you tell me more about that, Corey?
Yeah, so back in June, the Supreme Court issued a joint ruling in two cases. They're called Rucho v. Common Cause and Limon v. Benesek. Uh, Both of these cases centered on the question of partisan gerrymandering, whether or not it's a violation of federal law for redistricting authorities to draw maps that favor one political party over another. It's a question that the court had taken up a number of times in the past without issuing a definitive decision, and that changed in this joint ruling. The court ruled 5-4 that partisan gerrymandering claims are ultimately political questions and that they fall beyond the jurisdiction of federal courts. This means that anyone who might consider challenging a new map as a case of partisan gerrymandering will have to look beyond the federal courts for relief.
Okay, so the ruling in those cases has kind of set that at the federal level. How about challenges under state law? I know that last month there was a state court that struck down North Carolina's legislative districts as a partisan gerrymander. What
Yeah.
was the court's reasoning?
So in North Carolina, a state superior court threw out a map as a violation of the state constitution. And something similar happened last year in Pennsylvania too. So they're finding issues with partisan gerrymandering under the state constitution. And so with Rucho and Limon having settled the question at the federal level, it's possible we'll see more challenges like the ones in North Carolina and Pennsylvania, challenges that cite state constitutions and state statutes to challenge district maps.
All right, that's very fascinating. Okay, now let's turn to any states or any process changes that are happening for this upcoming cycle in 2020. I understand that there are some states since the 2010 cycle that have enacted changes to their redistricting processes. Can you give us those examples?
Yeah, Colorado and Michigan are two who did something similar. Last November, Colorado voters approved two constitutional amendments. One set up an independent commission for congressional redistricting, and the other set up an independent commission for state legislative redistricting. Voters in Michigan also approved a similar constitutional amendment that applies both to congressional and state legislative redistricting.
And so what was the former redistricting process in both of those?
So in Colorado, they're moving to an independent redistricting commission from a political appointee commission that was in charge of the state legislative redistricting. And the legislature was previously responsible for congressional redistricting. In Michigan, the state legislature was responsible for redistricting at both the congressional and state legislative levels.
So in both those cases, it looks like we've moved to an independent commission. What new processes are going to be used for these states in the 2020 cycle?
Yeah, the commissions are a little bit different. In Colorado, there will be two 12-member commissions responsible for approving new district plans. The composition of those commissions will be split between members belonging to political parties and unaffiliated members. And then a nonpartisan staff will produce district plans for the commission's consideration. In Michigan, there will be a 13-member commission, similarly split between political party members and unaffiliated members.
All right, and did these amendments in both Colorado and Michigan, which I know our ballot measures team was totally covered, it was really interesting to see, did they establish any new criteria similar to the ones that you mentioned before about, size and contiguousness and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, the Michigan amendment requires commissioners to prioritize a few factors, including contiguity, maintaining communities of interest, and compactness. It also prohibits maps that unfairly advantage political parties or incumbents. Under both Colorado amendments, districts must be competitive. And each of the two amendments defines competitiveness as a reasonable potential for a district to change parties at least once every 10 years.
Wow, that's a very interesting criteria. So are there any other states that have enacted changes to their redistricting processes since the 2010 cycle?
Yeah, Missouri voters approved a constitutional amendment that established the position of a state demographer, who will be tasked with submitting state legislative redistricting proposals to the existing redistricting authorities for their consideration. Ohio voters approved an amendment that made a number of changes to the state's congressional redistricting process, and Utah voters approved an amendment creating an advisory redistricting commission. In both Ohio and Utah, though, final redistricting authority will continue to rest with the legislature.
Okay, so it looks like we've definitely had some changes to certain states as we look ahead to 2020, which is what we'll do now. So looking ahead to the 2020 census, that it's going to provide the data for all of this activity. What do we know so far about the 2020 census? I mean, it's not that far away, right? What's the timeline?
No, it's not far away. It's happening now. Major census activity is already underway. So between January and September of this year, the Census Bureau opened 248 area census offices across the country. By April 1st of next year, 2020, every home in the country should receive census paperwork. And then in December 2020, the Census Bureau will deliver apportionment data to the President and the U.S. Congress. Apportionment is the process by which congressional representatives are assigned to the states. So that'll be by December 2020. By March 31st, 2021, the Census Bureau will send census data directly to the states for redistricting purposes.
Now, I also seem to recall, it was a pretty major story, a lot of litigation around the Trump administration's proposals to add a citizenship question to the 2020 census. Where does that stand? Will the census include that citizenship question?
No, there won't be a citizenship question on the 2020 census. After the proposal was made public, 3 federal district court judges blocked the change, and the issue went before the Supreme Court. On June 27th of this year, the Supreme Court found that the decision to add a citizenship question to the census was constitutional, but that the administration's rationale for the decision was inconsistent with the administrative record. After that, the Trump administration announced that it would no longer pursue adding the citizenship question to the 2020 census, settling the matter.
All right, so this has all been great context as we head into the 2020 elections and the subsequent redistricting cycle. I know we're going to be covering it quite extensively on Ballotpedia, and there's also going to be a lot of news between now and then. So thank you very much, Corey, for taking the time to talk to us about it.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
All right, so I hope you enjoyed this look at redistricting, which will be a very prominent topic, particularly in the months ahead. But as we've also seen in some of these court decisions and some of these other actions that have happened in between census cycles, it also generates news throughout the decade. It's a really fascinating area of the American democracy. And as we discussed, the upcoming elections in various states can also affect who is involved with redistricting, which depends, of course, on the state. And of course, we just talked about it, but I'll remind you that the 2020 census officially begins April 1st of next year, and that is less than 6 months from now, which is pretty amazing to think about. And speaking of state elections, I want to remind you that Louisiana is holding its primary elections on Saturday for governor, state legislature, other state executives. And if you're not familiar, Louisiana uses what's known as a blanket primary, where all candidates appear on the ballot regardless of party. And a candidate can win the election outright by receiving more than 50% of the primary vote. So check with us at Ballotpedia to keep on top of these results and other developments. And I know I'll be following those this weekend. And finally, this is a big week ahead. The Democratic presidential candidates will hold their 4th debate next week on the campus of Otterbein University in Westerville, Ohio. And to stay on top of things in the presidential race, I invite you to consider subscribing to either of our free email newsletters, which is the Daily Presidential News Briefing or the Weekly Presidential News Briefing. And both of them are really, really fantastic. Of course, please continue to stay in the know with all of our email newsletters, including the Daily Brew, which comes out every weekday, and our weekly news summary, The Tap. Thank you, everyone, for watching.